In August 1944, the jungles of Burma were still thick with gunfire and smoke. The battle between Allied and Japanese forces in the north, around Myitkyina, had dragged on for months. The air was heavy with humidity, mosquitoes, malaria, and the cries of wounded soldiers carried on muddy trucks under torrential rain. It was there that a small group of American soldiers from the psychological warfare team stumbled upon one of the darkest secrets of World War II. Women forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese army. As the campaign to liberate Myitkyina neared its end, American reconnaissance units moved through abandoned Japanese camps scattered along the supply lines. In one small wooden hut built hastily by the Irrawaddy River, they found strange signs. Bamboo beds lined up side by side, several sets of kimonos, and a wooden sign in Japanese that read, Weian Suo, Comfort Station. At first, they thought it had been quarters for nurses or civilian workers. Then, from a back room, a dozen trembling women emerged, clothes torn, skin bruised, eyes empty. They were not nurses. They were comfort women, women forced to provide sexual services for Japanese soldiers. According to their later testimonies, all the women were from the Korean peninsula, then under Japanese colonial rule. They knew nothing about Burma, spoke no English, and could hardly believe the war had reached so far. The American team immediately arranged for a Korean nurse who had lived in Seoul to serve as interpreter. Every word of their statements was carefully recorded, forming what would become Interrogation Report No. 49, one of the first documents ever to reveal the true nature of the Japanese comfort women system. The report began. This group of 20 women, aged between 17 and 35, was brought from Korea to Burma in 1942 under the designation of military service workers. They were recruited by civilian brokers who promised light work and high pay. Upon boarding the ship, their passports and papers were confiscated. They were then taken directly to Japanese camps and forced to serve soldiers. One woman, Kim Hak-sun, testified that she was only 19 when she left home. Her family was poor. Her father had died early. When a man in a Japanese police uniform came to her village saying that the government needs female workers for a textile factory, she believed him. She and several other girls were taken to Busan port and put aboard a cargo ship. After 2 weeks at sea, they landed in Rangoon, now Yangon. There, a Japanese officer and several intermediaries checked the list and divided the girls among different military units. Kim was sent deep into the jungles near Myitkyina. She had no idea where she was. The American report noted, the women were housed in bamboo barracks under guard. Each was forced to serve 20-30 soldiers daily, sometimes up to 60 after major battles. They followed a strict schedule, morning bath and health check, afternoon to evening servicing soldiers, and 2 hours rest at night. Each woman was required to keep a ledger recording the number of services, the supposed earnings, and the deductions for management, money they never saw. The women referred to their overseer as Chokan, a former Japanese non-commissioned officer who held the keys, controlled food and medical supplies, and beat anyone who resisted. When the Japanese retreated from Myitkyina, the Chokan ordered all records destroyed and took with him the younger, healthier women. The rest, sick and weak, were abandoned. These were the women the Americans found. One striking part of the report was the observation section. The U.S. officers were shocked by how organized the operation was. Invoices for condoms imported from Japan, daily income logs, even a price chart. 1 yen for privates, 1.5 for corporals, 2 for officers with a quarter of the proceeds going to the unit commander. The report concluded, this is a commercialized system of sexual exploitation, organized and directly managed by the Japanese military. It functioned as an official part of logistical operations, designed to maintain troop morale and control venereal disease. Behind these dry words lay countless tragedies. Another woman, Lee Soon-hwa, said she had tried to escape but was caught, tied to a post, and beaten unconscious. Afterwards, she was forced to work for 2 days straight to make up for the loss. Through tears, she said, we stopped thinking of ourselves as human. Every time we heard the sound of boots, we prayed not to be beaten. Many became pregnant, but childbirth was forbidden. When their bellies grew, they were sent for medical examinations and returned weak, their stomachs flat again. The report stated, Japanese army doctors performed forced abortions. Some women later died from infection. Others contracted sexually transmitted diseases. Those with syphilis or gonorrhea were isolated, injected with drugs, and forced to resume work as soon as their fever subsided. One woman recalled pleading for rest, only to be told by a guard, "The army doesn't need weak women, only tools." To the American soldiers who witnessed it, the sight was beyond comprehension. Major Carl W. E. Taylor, the team's commanding officer, wrote in his personal notes, "These women were not voluntary prostitutes, as Japanese propaganda claimed. They were victims of a state-organized system of sexual slavery. This cannot be dismissed as individual misconduct. It was policy." The report and accompanying photographs were sent to Allied Command in India, then forwarded to Washington. Though shocking, the information circulated only internally due to wartime priorities. No one then realized it would become the first, and for decades, the only record detailing Japan's comfort stations. After being rescued, the women were taken to an Allied medical camp. Some died within weeks from illness and exhaustion. The rest were transferred to India, then gradually repatriated via China. But post-war records do not say where they went. Only a few names remain: Kim Hak-sun, Lee Soon-hwa, and Park Ok-rai, fading into history among thousands of forgotten victims. For the U.S. military, report number 49 revealed that comfort women were not confined to Burma. In the following months, similar stations were uncovered in the Philippines, New Guinea, China, and even Saipan. Everywhere, the scenes were the same: makeshift huts, meticulous ledgers, and imprisoned women. These discoveries led American officers to a grim realization. Japan had built a vast network of sexual slavery across the Asia-Pacific, operated as a formal component of its military logistics. Yet it was not until decades later, when historians like Yoshimi Yoshiaki rediscovered these files, that the world understood their full significance. Tragically, the abandoned women found in the Burmese jungle in 1944, seemingly anonymous, became the first witnesses to one of the cruelest war crimes of the 20th century. They never knew that their trembling testimonies would be preserved in secret archives, waiting half a century to be declassified. In the 1990s, Korean journalists accidentally came across a copy of the report in U.S. Army archives. When an elderly woman named Kim Hak-sun read it, she wept. "The women in that report," she said, "were us. I know, because that story belongs to all of us who were deceived, captured, and forced to do the unspeakable." In 1991, she became the first to publicly declare herself a former comfort woman, sparking a global movement for justice for tens of thousands of forgotten victims. Looking back, the 1944 discovery in Burma was not mere coincidence. It marked the beginning of the unveiling of a nationwide system of war crimes hidden beneath the cold language of bureaucracy and the machinery of modern warfare. The American soldiers of that time may not have grasped its historical gravity, but before their eyes, the truth had surfaced. This was no longer a war between armies. It was a war that had consumed humanity itself. And in that humid Burmese jungle, when the Korean women stepped out of the wooden hut, trembling and holding one another's hands, they were not just walking out of a Japanese prison camp. They were stepping, unknowingly, into the first page of a historical record, one that would one day expose the darkest shadow of war. In the winter of 1932, on the streets of Shanghai, Chinese citizens watched as Japanese troops marched into the city, bringing with them weapons, supplies, and a series of special convoys carrying young women. No one knew who these women were. They were escorted into a row of small houses near the military barracks. Hanging at the entrance was a Japanese sign, Weian-suo, Comfort Station. That was the first time the term appeared officially within the Japanese military system, marking the birth of a state-organized and legitimized mechanism of sexual slavery. At first, the reason seemed simple. After the Shanghai incident of 1932, Japanese commanders feared that their soldiers might rape civilians and provoke international outrage. Some officers proposed a controlled solution to establish comfort stations where soldiers could satisfy their physiological needs under supervision. The Imperial Army quickly approved the idea, and from there, a vast military prostitution apparatus was built, disguised as a public health and discipline initiative. Early military documents described these stations in bureaucratic, clinical language. The 1937 Army Field Service Regulations stated, "Select women who are healthy, of good background, and of appropriate age. Comfort stations must be inspected regularly, maintain health records, and serve only authorized personnel." In reality, selection meant abduction, deception, or coercion. The Japanese authorities and private brokers worked hand in hand, traveling to impoverished regions of Korea, Taiwan, China, and later Southeast Asia, spreading false advertisements for factory jobs or tea house attendants. Thousands of young women, most illiterate, believed promises of easy work and good pay. They left home and vanished forever. According to historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki, in 1938, the Japanese Army issued Directive No. 2197, officially allowing the transport of women to the front lines aboard military ships using special travel permits issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs. This order proved beyond doubt that the Comfort Women system was not a private enterprise, but a state policy. Each military unit was required to maintain its own comfort station, or contract a civilian operator under military supervision. By 1939, as the Sino-Japanese War spread, comfort stations multiplied across occupied China. In Nanjing, after the infamous massacre of 1937, the Japanese established 23 stations in just 2 months. In Beijing, Tianjin, Wuhan, wherever there were garrisons, there were comfort stations. A 1940 Japanese medical report stated, "In September, station number 5 served an average of 300 soldiers per day, total income 780 yen, venereal infections decreased by 40%. These cold numbers spoke only of efficiency, not of human suffering. When World War II expanded, the system followed Japan's armies across the Asia-Pacific. In Manchuria, stations were built along the South Manchurian Railway. In the Philippines, hundreds of local women were seized from coastal villages and brought to military camps in Manila, Cebu, and Davao. In Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces enslaved Dutch, Chinese, and Indonesian women in comfort houses around Batavia. In New Guinea, Saipan, and Okinawa, the same sign, Weian Suo, stood beside every camp gate. The scale was staggering. Allied post-war reports estimated between 1,600 and 2,000 comfort stations, enslaving 150,000 to 200,000 women. About 80% were Korean. Others were Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, Malaysian, Burmese, Vietnamese, and even some Dutch and Australian women captured in colonies. A former Japanese officer later testified, "No unit went to the front without comfort women. They were part of our supplies, like ammunition, medicine, and rations." Official documents used euphemisms to mask the brutality. Special services, tokushujimu, military service women, jugunfu, sanitary facilities, aisei shisetsu. In reality, they were organized rape camps. Women were forced to serve dozens of soldiers daily, beaten if they resisted, subjected to medical inspections, and had their earnings confiscated by the army. Pregnant women were forced to abort. Those who fell ill were isolated, treated briefly, and sent back to work. Each station followed a standardized structure, typically 10-30 women divided by rooms, overseen by a manager, often a Japanese ex-soldier or civilian contractor. Above him was a military officer responsible for security and medical reports. Weekly health reports were sent to headquarters, listing the number of venereal disease cases, women unfit for work, and average service count. Captured medical records from the Philippines even contained price tables. Private, corporal, 1.5 yen per visit. Sergeant, 2 yen. Officer, 3 to 5 yen. Senior. Officer, 10 yen, with private room. Part of the money went to the unit as maintenance fees. None reached the women. When they fell ill or collapsed, they were replaced. New victims brought from distant villages. The logistics behind this system were astonishingly complex. The transport of comfort women was coordinated by Japan's Army, Navy, Foreign Ministry, and Home Ministry. Japanese embassies and consulates in Indochina, Manchuria, and the Dutch East Indies issued temporary travel permits. Archival records found in Tokyo in 1992 revealed that the Southern Expeditionary Army Command approved at least 100 military transport voyages carrying women to Southeast Asia between 1942 and 1944. This proved that the system was not the misconduct of rogue officers. It was a fully institutionalized military policy. A 1943 Navy report stated bluntly, "Comfort stations have demonstrated value in maintaining troop morale, preventing civilian rape, and reducing disease. The system should be expanded throughout the Pacific theater." But maintaining morale meant destroying the humanity of others. In the final years of the war, as Japan faced defeat, the stations became more brutal. On Saipan, many women were forced to commit suicide when told that the Americans would torture and kill them. In the Philippines, Japanese troops massacred hundreds of women before retreating to erase evidence. A few survived, later telling their stories in Allied interrogations in 1944-45. When the war ended, the system collapsed with the Japanese Empire. Tens of thousands of women were left behind, stateless, homeless, and traumatized. Many died of disease or starvation. Others were shunned by their communities out of shame. In the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal records, comfort stations were mentioned only briefly, and no one was prosecuted. Allied investigators viewed it as a moral issue, not a war crime. Thus, one of the largest state-run sexual slavery systems in modern history disappeared into silence. It was not until the 1990s that historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki unearthed documents in Japan's National Archives titled "Recruitment of Women for Military Service" and "Regulations for Comfort Stations." One 1938 memorandum from the Army instructed local police to cooperate in recruiting suitable women and ensure they carried medical certificates, clear proof of direct government involvement in supplying women to the military. From Shanghai to Manila, from Nanjing to Saipan, the system's footprint stretched across the entire map of the Asia-Pacific War. Wherever Japanese troops marched, there were comfort women. Wherever there were comfort stations, there were cries, blood, and lives buried in silence. It was not merely a prostitution system. It was part of Japan's war machine, designed to sustain its soldiers by sacrificing women's bodies. Hundreds of thousands were turned into disposable resources, counted, logged, rotated, and discarded like commodities. Reading these documents today, one shudders at the coldness of bureaucratic language. Replace 5 due to illness. Monthly revenue decreased 20% due to weather. Not a single word about suffering or humanity. Yet those very words stand as the most damning evidence that this atrocity was no accident. It was planned, executed, and protected by the full machinery of Japan's wartime state. From Shanghai in 1932 to Saipan in 1944, 12 years in which war transformed Asian women into instruments of empire and imperial domination into a military sex industry. When the last comfort stations fell with the Japanese Empire, what remained was not victory, but a permanent stain, one of the darkest marks on the conscience of humankind. When the fronts of World War II began to turn in late 1944, the Allied armies gradually advanced into territories long occupied by Imperial Japan. Along with the collapse of Japan's defensive network, one of its darkest secrets was slowly uncovered. The comfort stations scattered throughout military bases, warehouses, villages, and even underground bunkers near the front lines. There, tens of thousands of women were imprisoned and forced to serve Japanese soldiers under the pretext of maintaining troop morale. As American, British, and Chinese nationalist forces liberated these regions, they began to uncover horrifying evidence that had previously only appeared in scattered intelligence reports. One of the earliest discoveries occurred in Yunnan, China, in early 1945. During a joint operation between the U.S. 14th Air Force and Chinese anti-Japanese forces, American troops captured a small outpost that had served as a Japanese logistics base. Inside, they found a group of Korean and Chinese women, most of them emaciated, diseased, and in a state of extreme terror. The women revealed that they had been forced to work as comfort women for the Japanese garrison stationed there. According to their testimonies, they were made to serve 20 to 30 soldiers a day, beaten if they resisted, and fed only leftovers after the soldiers had eaten. Some were pregnant or wounded. When the Americans arrived, the women initially believed they were about to be killed, as they had been told for years that Americans were demons. Only after being given food, baths, and medical care did they begin to realize that they had truly been freed. Among the rescued was a young woman named Park Young-sim, barely in her 20s. She would later become one of the most important witnesses in international investigations. Park recounted that she had been deceived into taking a factory job in Korea, but was instead shipped directly to China. She lived in a small wooden room with no windows, forced to line up every morning for medical inspections before being raped by soldiers. When the Americans arrived, the women were locked in a cellar. The Japanese soldiers fled, leaving them in darkness for 3 days without water. Her testimony, later documented by war correspondents and historians, became a symbol of the hundreds of thousands of voices long buried in silence. At the same time, U.S. Army photographer Charles Hatfield and Officer Edward Fay were tasked with documenting recently liberated areas in China. When they arrived in Yunnan, Hatfield took a series of photographs showing the rescued women being cared for, bandaged, and fed by American troops. In those photos, the faces of the young women, at once fearful and relieved, revealed a complex mixture of horror and hope. These became the first photographic evidence of comfort women's liberation during World War II. The images were stored in U.S. military archives and remained unpublished for decades. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the discoveries were even more shocking. When U.S. forces entered Manila in February 1945, they found numerous Japanese military brothels still in operation or recently abandoned. The small buildings bore Japanese signs, with beds lined in rows and logbooks detailing the number of clients per day, clear evidence of a tightly organized system. American military investigators seized hundreds of pages of documents, including lists of women, military medical logs, and standardized pricing tables. Privates paid the least, officers paid more, and the women were categorized by nationality and reproductive health. A U.S. Army Medical Corps report from March 1945 stated, "These stations operated as military facilities, with supervisors, regulations, schedules, and compulsory medical inspections. This was not a private enterprise, but part of the Japanese Army's control system." The report described the women's dire conditions. Many suffered from venereal diseases, unwanted pregnancies, and severe malnutrition. Some did not speak Japanese, communicating only in Korean or Tagalog, which initially hindered interrogations. Through local interpreters, however, they gradually recounted how they had been abducted and enslaved. By April 1945, U.S. units in Okinawa discovered a vast network of comfort stations serving the Japanese troops entrenched on the island. According to U.S. psychological warfare records, over 140 comfort stations had been established there. As defeat loomed, many Japanese soldiers forced women to commit suicide or killed them themselves, believing that surrender would bring shame. In many cases, American troops found only bodies, some bound, others lying beside grenades. The scenes haunted many soldiers, prompting U.S. authorities to initially classify early comfort women reports as secret, fearing they would shock the American public. In Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia, British and Dutch forces made similar discoveries. When Singapore was liberated in September 1945, British troops found dozens of Dutch, Chinese, and Indonesian women imprisoned in barracks once run by the Japanese. Some had been taken when they were still minors. Dutch officers later launched their own investigations, gathering evidence for the Batavia War Crimes Tribunal, where several Japanese officers were convicted for forcing Dutch women into sexual slavery, the only post-war trial in which this crime was publicly prosecuted. Evidence from across Southeast Asia was compiled by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, which specialized in translating and analyzing captured Japanese documents. Linguists in ATIS uncovered numerous euphemisms in administrative texts: special service woman, recreation area, medical treatment schedule, all coded references to systematic rape. The bureaucratic precision of these terms was so deceptive that their true meaning took years to decipher. After the war, photographs, films, and testimonies were preserved in the U.S. National Archives, the Imperial War Museum in Britain, and Dutch collections. Footage of American troops rescuing women in China and the Philippines later appeared in documentaries such as Comfort Women, A War Crime, 1992, and The Apology, 2016. These materials confirmed that the Comfort Women system was not the result of wartime chaos or rogue soldiers, but a deliberate policy sanctioned by the Japanese military. On the Japanese side, most wartime records were deliberately destroyed to erase evidence. However, surviving or captured documents from remote outposts were sufficient to reconstruct the system's structure. A 1938 directive from the Japanese Army to its China-based units stated, "The establishment of comfort facilities is necessary to maintain order, protect soldiers' morality, and prevent the rape of local civilians." What appeared as moral concern in writing was, in truth, a bureaucratic justification for mass sexual enslavement. When the war ended, thousands of women were left abandoned on isolated islands or in ruined camps, uncared for, undocumented, unable to return home. Many died of disease or were ostracized by their communities. Those who survived endured decades of silence. For many American veterans, the image of frail, terrified women, speaking languages they couldn't understand yet bowing in gratitude for a sip of water, remained one of the war's most tragic memories. The photographic and testimonial evidence from the liberation period of 1944-1945 not only confirmed the true scale of the Comfort Women system, but also exposed its organized institutional nature. It could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or local excesses, but recognized as part of Imperial Japan's military and social strategy. Thanks to this evidence, historians such as Yoshimi Yoshiaki, George Hicks, and Kevin Gray were later able to reconstruct the entire system, showing that from Shanghai and Manchuria to Saipan and Okinawa, Japan's network of sexual slavery operated under centralized military supervision. Thus, the Allied liberation in the final years of the war was not only a military victory, it was an act of unveiling truth. The photos, testimonies, and medical reports from 1944-1945 became the foundation for decades of research and the long struggle for justice by survivors. And though most of those women are now gone, the images they left behind continue to speak. A solemn reminder that some victories are not won with guns, but with the courage to face pain and refuse to let it be forgotten. When World War II ended in August 1945, Japan surrendered, and a new chapter of history began. Across Asia, internment camps, military brothels, and comfort stations were abandoned or taken over. Tens of thousands of women were left in desperate conditions. Some were rescued by Allied forces, others hid among local civilians, and many died in silence, unrecorded and forgotten. Yet the brutal truth of what they had endured was quickly buried under the new priorities of the post-war world: Reconstruction, politics, and the Cold War. In that climate, the issue of comfort women, sexual slavery under the Japanese military, gradually slipped into a historical void where silence and denial replaced justice. Immediately after the war, the Allies established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, commonly known as the Tokyo Trials, to prosecute Japan's war crimes. Among hundreds of charges, massacres, biological experiments, torture, none concerned the comfort women system. This was not due to a lack of evidence. The U.S. military already possessed documents, testimonies, and witnesses. Rather, prosecutors, mainly from the U.S., UK, China, and the Soviet Union, chose to focus on broader crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, such as the Nanjing Massacre or forced labor. At the time, sexual slavery was seen merely as a byproduct of war, not a systematic atrocity. Moreover, most victims were poor Asian women with no clear nationality or legal representation, their voices excluded from international proceedings. Only one tribunal, the Dutch War Crimes Court in Batavia, now Jakarta, Indonesia, in 1948, prosecuted and convicted Japanese officers for forcing Dutch women held in camps into sexual slavery. Lieutenant Colonel Okada Tetsuo was sentenced to death, marking the first and only post-war case that recognized comfort women as victims of war crimes. Yet that trial dealt only with European victims. The women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia remained unacknowledged. The world stayed silent, silence that lasted nearly half a century. In Japan, during the American occupation, 1945-1952, the U.S. supervised government began rebuilding the nation's image. Washington needed a stable Japan to counter the growing communist bloc in Asia, especially after the Korean War broke out in 1950. Sensitive issues related to Japan's war crimes were downplayed or ignored to prevent unrest. Thousands of military documents were destroyed. Officers involved in the comfort women system were released early or reinstated into post-war government roles. Under U.S. censorship, Japanese newspapers were forbidden to discuss topics that could disturb public order, including rape, slavery, or wartime coercion. During this period, collective memory of the comfort women was pushed outside the boundaries of official history. For survivors, peacetime proved even harsher than war. Many could not return home due to stigma and shame. In Confucian Korea, chastity was paramount. Victims of rape were seen as disgraces to their families. Most hid their identities, changed their names, and lived in poverty. Some were forced into marriages. Others worked in civilian brothels to survive. In the Philippines, Indonesia, and China, the situation was similar. Newly independent governments focused on rebuilding and avoided reopening painful wounds tied to colonialism and war. In the 1950s and 1960s, Japan's rapid economic recovery ushered in the so-called economic miracle. In this forward-looking atmosphere, few wished to revisit the past, and the government sought to redefine the military's wartime role. In school textbooks, words like invasion were replaced by advance, occupation by liberation, and the comfort women were erased entirely. Japanese children grew up unaware that their army had once operated a continent-wide network of sexual slavery. Meanwhile, conservative historians and veterans began publishing self-justifying memoirs. They described the women as volunteers, professional prostitutes, or well-treated workers. Some even claimed the system was more humane than letting soldiers rape civilians. These distortions, reinforced by the lack of public evidence, helped the world forget the truth. In the U.S., documents on comfort women were classified for decades as Washington prioritized its Cold War alliance with Tokyo. Western researchers only gained access to them after partial declassification in the 1980s and 1990s. Then, interrogation reports from 1944 in Burma and Yunnan surfaced, revealing that the U.S. military had known about the system long before the war ended. The silence of 45 years was finally broken in 1991 when Kim Hak-sun, a 67-year-old Korean woman, stood before television cameras and declared, "I was a victim of the Japanese army." She recounted being deceived into factory work, sent to China, and raped repeatedly each day at a comfort station. Her testimony shocked Korea and the world. Hundreds of other women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia soon came forward. The movement for justice for comfort women had begun. Public pressure forced the Japanese government to respond. In 1992, historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki discovered documents in the Defense Ministry archives proving that comfort stations were established and directly managed by the military, not private contractors. Under growing scrutiny, Chief Cabinet Secretary Kōno issued the 1993 Kōno Statement, admitting the Army's direct involvement and expressing sincere apologies and remorse. However, the statement carried no legal weight and offered no official state compensation, only political goodwill. In 1995, Japan established the Asian Women's Fund, financed by private donations rather than government funds, to provide humanitarian aid to victims. Critics denounced it as an evasion of legal responsibility, since it did not acknowledge the crimes as acts of war. South Korea and other nations rejected it, insisting that only an official state apology and compensation would suffice. By the 2000s, denial resurfaced within Japanese politics. Right-wing leaders, including Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, claimed there was no evidence of military coercion, arguing many women were paid prostitutes. Such statements drew international condemnation. In 2007, the U.S. House of Representatives passed Resolution 121, urging Japan to acknowledge, apologize, and educate future generations about the comfort women system. Parliaments in Canada, the Netherlands, South Korea, and the European Union issued similar resolutions. Meanwhile, survivors continued their struggle. In Seoul since 1992, protesters have gathered every Wednesday in front of the Japanese embassy, the world's longest-running protest. They erected the Comfort Woman statue, a bronze girl seated with distant eyes, as a symbol of remembrance and resilience. These statues now stand in cities worldwide: Seoul, San Francisco, Berlin, Sydney, Toronto, despite Japan's protests. Inside Japan, society remains deeply divided. On one side are scholars, journalists, and human rights activists calling for honesty. On the other, nationalists seeking to protect Japan's honor. Textbooks have been repeatedly revised, documentaries censored or banned. Yet younger generations are increasingly seeking the truth. Universities have opened seminars, and small citizen-run museums preserve the memories of women once forgotten. For survivors, the fight was never just for compensation. It was for recognition as human beings, for the right to tell the truth they had buried for half a century. As the 21st century advances, most have grown old or passed away. Kim Hak-sun, Lee Yang-soo, and others have said, "We don't want money. We just want Japan to tell the truth." Silence and denial, therefore, are not only political consequences but moral tragedies. They reveal how power defines memory, who gets to speak, and who is forced to be silent. Yet history shows that memory cannot be buried forever. From the black and white photos of Yunnan in 1945 to the bronze girl before the Japanese embassy in Seoul, the story of the comfort women endures, as a reminder that truth can be hidden but never erased. And only when a nation dares to face its own darkness can justice truly be reborn. When the war ended in August 1945, hundreds of thousands of women who had been forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military were left scattered across Asia and the Pacific. Many were killed to erase evidence. Others were abandoned in jungles or in the ruins of military camps, without papers, without names. Those who survived quietly returned home, carrying with them physical wounds, deep humiliation, and memories no one wanted to recall. In the conservative post-war societies of Korea, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia, a woman who had been raped was considered a taboo subject. No one wanted to listen, and they themselves dared not speak. Meanwhile, in Japan, public memory of the comfort women system gradually disappeared. School curricula, newspapers, and films rarely mentioned it. And when they did, they described it as private brothels for soldiers, deliberately avoiding the reality of organized sexual slavery. From 1946 to 1948, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, prosecuted major Japanese war crimes, but omitted the issue of comfort women from its indictments. Many historians later argued this was a deliberate omission. The Allies preferred to focus on clearer crimes, such as the Nanjing Massacre Unit 731's biological experiments, and crimes against humanity, while avoiding the sensitive, culturally charged subject of sexual violence, difficult to prove and politically volatile. Only some regional war crimes courts, such as the Dutch Tribunal in Batavia, Indonesia, prosecuted and convicted Japanese officers for forcing Dutch women in internment camps into sexual slavery. But for the vast majority of Asian victims, there were no trials, no reparations, and not even official recognition as victims of war. During the Cold War, as Japan became a key U.S. ally in Asia, the issue was further buried. The governments of South Korea, China, and the Philippines also avoided reopening the past. They needed Japanese aid and economic cooperation more than historical confrontation. Silence lasted for decades. The women who had once been comfort women grew old in obscurity. Many bore children without knowing who their fathers were. Others became infertile from disease and abuse. Some tried to forget. Others carried the trauma all their lives. It was not until the early 1980s that Japanese historians such as Yoshimi Yoshiaki and Hata Ikuhiko began examining archives from the Defense Ministry and National Archives. They discovered military documents clearly proving that the Japanese government and army had directly organized, managed, and supervised the comfort women system. These records included permits for comfort stations, detailed medical inspection guidelines, accounting procedures for money earned from serving soldiers, and recruitment orders targeting women from Korea, Taiwan, and mainland China. The evidence completely refuted Japan's long-standing claim that the brothels had been privately run. Then in 1991 came a turning point. Kim Hak-sun, a 67-year-old Korean woman, appeared on television and testified publicly that she had been abducted by the Japanese military at age 17 and repeatedly raped at a military comfort station. She was the first survivor to break nearly 50 years of silence. Her words shocked Korea and reverberated around the world, sparking a global movement for justice. Hundreds of other women, from Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and even the Netherlands, soon came forward, revealing their identities and demanding that Japan acknowledge, apologize, and compensate. Under mounting international pressure and media scrutiny, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Kōno issued the Kōno Statement in 1993, officially admitting that the Japanese military was directly involved in the establishment and management of comfort stations, and that many women were forced to work against their will. The government expressed deep remorse and sincere apologies to the victims. It was the first time Japan had formally acknowledged responsibility. Yet reparations were not paid from the state treasury, but through the Asian Women's Fund, created in 1995 and financed by private donations from Japanese citizens. Many survivors rejected the payments, calling them an evasion of legal responsibility, and demanded official compensation from the Japanese government. At the same time, social movements and human rights groups across Korea, Japan, and the West organized people's tribunals, exhibitions, conferences, and global campaigns. One of the most notable events was the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery, held in Tokyo in 2000. More than 75 witnesses and international experts participated. Though symbolic and organized by civil society rather than governments, the tribunal convicted Emperor Hirohito and the Japanese state of crimes of sexual slavery, marking the first time the voices of forgotten women were heard in an international courtroom. During the 2000s and 2010s, the comfort women issue became one of the most contentious topics in Japanese politics. Some conservative politicians, especially from the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, sought to downplay or deny responsibility, claiming there is no evidence of coercion, or that these women were paid workers. Right-wing groups even lobbied to remove comfort woman statues in Korea, the US, and Europe. However, international organizations such as the United Nations, Amnesty International, and the European Parliament passed resolutions urging Japan to issue a formal state apology and provide full compensation. In South Korea since 1992, the Wednesday demonstrations have been held every week in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. Citizens, students, and human rights activists gather to honor the victims and demand justice. In 2011, at the very site of these protests, the Statue of Peace was erected, a bronze sculpture of a young girl sitting barefoot on a wooden chair, her calm gaze filled with quiet defiance. The statue has become a global symbol of remembrance and justice, replicated in more than 30 cities worldwide. Today, only a few dozen survivors remain, most in their 90s. Time cannot erase the past, yet they continue to tell their stories to younger generations, to remind the world that war kills not only with bullets, but with silence, and with the erasure of shame from history. The story of the comfort women is no longer merely a dark chapter of Japan as past. It is a universal warning about how military power can violate the human body and spirit, and about the moral duty of memory and accountability. In recent years, Japanese and international historians have continued gathering testimonies, documents, and photographs. Museums and research centers in Seoul, Tokyo, Manila, and Taipei now preserve the legacy of these women. Academically, the comfort women issue has entered global scholarship on gender, memory, and wartime atrocities. A new generation of Japanese scholars, unlike their conservative predecessors, has openly admitted that denying the past is a betrayal of the Japanese people themselves, for only by confronting truth can a nation truly move forward. Symbolically, the revival of comfort women memory has become a global movement for gender justice. From Asia to Europe, from the Americas to Australia, feminist organizations, historians, artists, and filmmakers have brought the story to screens, classrooms, and galleries. Documentaries such as The Apology Spirit's Homecoming and Herstory have shown global audiences that behind the statistics lie real lives. Girls of 14 or 15 whose childhoods were stolen turned into instruments of war, yet courageous enough to reclaim their voices before the world. Today, even as diplomatic tensions persist among Japan, Korea, and other former occupied nations, the human truth transcends politics. Each monument, each commemoration, each survivor's testimony stands as an act of resistance against forgetting. History only holds meaning when humanity dares to face it. And in that gaze, the story of the comfort women, from Burma to Manila, from Seoul to Tokyo, remains not merely a tragedy of the past, but a living reminder of dignity, memory, and justice for generations to come.